Okay, thank you everyone. This is Jonathan Berry from Accelatis. We can get started now. Just a little bit of background. Everyone is currently in listen-only mode. So we encourage questions. Given the format of the 21 minutes, we may or may not be able to answer them on the call, but we will definitely get back to everyone. There will be a recording available, so if you're interested in having a copy of the recording or a link to the recording, please reach out to us, and we'll be happy to provide that to you. So again, thank you for joining. What we're going to be talking today is really opening the black box on Oracle Hyperion user activity tracking, and we'll show you how we do that shortly. So given the format, I will not be going into every detail on the slide, so you can go back and look at the recording after the fact, but we'll be going through the slides, and then we'll actually go into a demo of the product itself. So our agenda today, we'll be doing a very quick intro on Accelatis, then we'll get into discussing user activity tracking, about what it is, why it's important, and what we do and how we provide that information. And then we'll actually show a scenario right within the Accelatis product. So the first, a little bit of background, is Accelatis is not a consulting company. We are a provider of enterprise software solutions. So we provide the software, but we do not do implementations or consulting of other types. The background is, firstly, I founded the company in 2008, and I was a long-time engineer and director on the Hyperion Financial Management product, and our team is made primarily of Hyperion technologists and developers, so we're really uniquely situated to be providing the type of solution that we do. So what is user activity tracking? What it really is about capturing what users are doing on the system. And again, the information that's important to you, and I imagine you already know this, and that's why you joined the webinar, is knowing who is doing what and what they are doing. So we want to capture who the user is, what type of operations they're doing, and on what server, including what the product is, what the module is, what the actual activity is, and even get into what the document that they're working on. So if it's a financial report, if it's a smart view grid, if it's a planning business rule. We also want to know how long the operation took, and also if there's any additional information. So for example, in HFM Smart View, we can capture how many cells were being requested or saved or so on, so that type of information. So what type of information can we gather? So right out of the box for Oracle Hyperion, we can capture things like Hyperion planning with rules, forms in Smart View, financial reports. For interactive reporting, we can also capture HFM and HFM Smart View. And that is out of the box. Additionally, we can capture pretty much any web-based activity. So anything coming in through a web server, we can capture and report on. And we can also capture information that comes out of server-based logs as well. Some of the challenges that you have today is knowing how important this information is. Not all the information is available in logs, and if it is in a log, it's available in different formats. So some are database focused, some are more flat file focused, but it's not available in one place. And ultimately, being able to get at the information is the first step. We need to be able to very quickly see how user activity affects the rest of the system. So what Accelatis does is that if we look at this screen from the bottom up, is that there's different things that exist today. There is activity that's coming from existing logs. There's synthetic activity that Accelatis generates from our load generation module, and there's real-time user activity that we're actually capturing as it happens. So to be clear, we are not just scraping information from logs, we are actively capturing user activity as it's coming to the system. And regardless of the source of the activity, it all goes into the Accelatis Performance database. And once it's there, we can provide a wealth of data on that information. So we can provide, and we're going to show this today, we'll provide ad hoc analysis on what's happening as it's happening. We can provide various dashboards and graphs. We can provide various formatted reports on both based on a transactional view of what the users are doing, as well as a statistical view of what's happening with the documents in the system. And lastly, we can provide information on service level agreements. So as we're capturing user activity, we can provide information on how that activity adheres to agreements that have been put in place in your environment. Okay, so the benefits of doing this are probably pretty clear. Again, otherwise you wouldn't have joined, is that And getting the information in one place that's going to be consistent across the products, meaning whether it's HFM or planning or SBase or reports, you're getting the user type activity information in one consistent format. We're also going to be able to look at not only what's happening, but what's not happening. So imagine you're doing a migration and you have 1,000 financial reports. If you knew that 700 of the reports have not been used in the last 90 days, you may decide not to migrate them. So collecting information what's happening is useful for not only what people are doing, but maybe what also is not being done. And then we want to get into some details. We want to know what are the slowest performing reports and what are the ones that are accessed the most, because ultimately we may be trying to track down a problem, or we may be trying to profile our environment to know how the system is being used. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, and we'll show this in our demo, we want to understand how user activity affects system performance and very quickly be able to connect the dots, and we're going to show how we can do this with the tool. So as part of the demo, we're going to show a couple of things. But first and foremost, we're going to show how to look at data at a number of different levels. The first level we're going to show is very quick and dirty. We're going to look at data really in real time and look at each individual transaction, what users are doing, what documents they're operating on, how long it's taking. We're then going to try to reconcile what users are doing with other things that are happening in the system, along with key KPIs, both Hyperion KPIs that are exclusive to Accelatis, as well as system KPIs like memory and CPU and these sorts of things. We're then going to get into another level of looking at this where we can look at graphs and look at how we can graph response over time. So you can see that how during the financial close, certain forms take a lot longer to execute than the middle of the month, for example. And we'll also get into production reports. So formatted reports available in a number of formats, including PDF or Excel, on what users are doing, as well as looking at a breakdown of how the system is being accessed. And then lastly, we'll get into looking at SLAs and dashboards, which is another, again, it's more of an aggregate view of what's happening with performance on the system. Okay. So the scenario that we're going to look at something very specific. Imagine that a user calls the help desk, and the problem that they report is that a planning form is taking 3 times as longer than usual to execute. And in this case, let's just say that the time of the problem was 3:50 p.m. Yesterday, for example. And the tools that we're going to show could be literally in real time as it's happening, or we could go back in time and look at data that took place or activity that took place 2 months ago. It's all in the system. In this case, we're going to be looking at something that happened yesterday. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to my image where I'm running Accelatis, where I have some data that I recorded yesterday. And if I am the administrator and I want to track down, if I want to come up with an answer of why those planning forms were taking a long time or why that business rule is taking a long time, I'm going to first start out in activity analysis. And I want to look at data over a certain window. So I've already kind of set this up. So I set this up for around 3:40 to 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. So we're going to look at a 20-minute window. Let me just make sure okay, so let me reset this. We'll look at this yesterday. We're going to look at the 24th from around 3:40 to around 4 o'clock. Okay. Now, we could manually go through here and pick the different types of activity that we want, whether it's HFM activity, planning activity. Out of the box, we have an implementation wizard that creates various graphs and dashboards and reports. And we have a filter now called planning activity. So we're going to go ahead and grab that. And we start out where everything's kind of small, so I'm just going to zoom into that window. And I'm going to increase this, make this a little bit easier to read. And what we can see right away is we are looking at activity. And I can see rules that have been executing. And each one of these bubbles represents something that a user was doing. So in this case, I can see a planning rule called, it's a MORT for probably amortization. And it looks like it took 43 seconds. I see the user was Jay Smith, and this happened around 3:50 p.m. yesterday. And I can see some other ones. Aggregating data took 19 seconds. And as I go back in time, I see that some of these same rules took a lot less time to execute just 15 minutes earlier. And now if I come up to planning forms, I can see some forms that were very quick, taking 3 to 4 seconds, started taking much longer, 10 seconds, 12 seconds, that sort of thing, later in the day. Now we want to know, so clearly there was a slowdown, and we want to know how or what was causing the slowdown. So the first thing is we want to do a little analysis on this. So I'm going to quickly pull up a graph. Again, the majority of what you're seeing today is all created out of the box. There's very little custom graph activity. And what we're doing here is we have a graph which we're looking at, which is showing performance over time of both planning rules and planning forms. And we can see that yesterday around 3:40 p.m., if we look at the blue line, these are an aggregate of all of our forms. We could actually focus on a single planning form or a single planning business rule. For demonstration purposes, I've taken a couple of shortcuts, and we're looking at the aggregate of all planning forms, which may not always make sense, but in this case it's going to make a lot of sense because we can look at it all together. And what it's saying is that over time, in this 20-minute period, our planning forms were executing at about 3 seconds. And we can look at this value here. This is in milliseconds. And we can see that this actually, every specific data sample that we're looking at corresponds to one of these little blips up on the top window. And we can see that, boy, from 3:40 p.m. to around 3:50 p.m., things got a lot slower. So what started out as 3 seconds now is in the 10-second range. And funny enough, looking at our planning business rules, things that were in the 12-second range now all of a sudden are taking 45 seconds. So it looks like performance doubled or tripled or even more in some cases for both planning forms and business rules. And then it looks like around 4 p.m. things started going back to normal. So we have validated that there was a performance issue yesterday afternoon. We've been able to come in and see exactly who's doing what on the system. So we know that Jay Smith was affected by running his business rule at this time. So something was taking 43 seconds that just 20 minutes earlier was taking this user about 15 seconds. So we have quantified that request that came into the help desk is factual. And that's the first thing, because often you might get a request and it's all secondhand information, and what's slow to someone might be fast for another. So we have quantified that something has actually happened in the system. And we have real data to look at who's doing what. In one case, we're looking at it, and we could actually stream this in real time and watch it while it's happening. So we're seeing who's doing what happened during this time, and we've put some graphs to it so that we can visually kind of see what's happening in the system. So now our goal is to figure out, is it the activity that was on the system causing the slowdown, or something else causing the problem? So what we're going to do now is I'm going to start layering in other performance data. And I'm going to pick another graph that I made, which is the same planning activity, but I'm also including the CPU. So we want to know whether this planning activity is the cause of the problem or is it being affected by something else. And now we have one more piece of quantifiable information, and that is that during this period, our CPU started to become saturated. So what started out as in the 20% level, we can see our little value here, the CPU got busier and busier and busier, and it looks like it peaked right around just before 4 o'clock. So we might say that, boy, these planning rules and forms cause the CPU to spike, and therefore it's slowing everything down. Or we might say that something else is causing the CPU to spike, and therefore our planning business rules and forms are slow. Okay, now which is it? Is it cause and effect or vice versa? And now when I look at this, I see, well, look, the planning business rules and forms, yeah, sure, they got slower, but there are these breaks of activity, meaning nothing was happening during this time. So I wouldn't really say that the planning forms and business rules caused the CPU to spike, because there are periods of activity when nothing was happening and our CPU still became busier. So we need to look somewhere else. Now in this case, because this is a kind of a concentrated example, I have planning and financial reports running on the same server. And the first activity graph that we did was limited to planning activity. So we're only looking at planning activity. But we're going to change our filter so that we can go back and grab all activity on the system during this period. So now I'm graphing everything that was happening on the server. And now we're getting a little bit of more detail on what's happening. And I can even go back and see that someone opened an HFM form back here around 3:41 yesterday, but it doesn't look like there was any other HFM activity, so I'm going to kind of rule that out. But look here, we have financial reports, and we can see a lot of these blips happening. We can see, okay, there were a couple here, and then there's this burst of activity of financial reports occurring right around the time that the CPU spiked. And if we want, we could start to isolate this and look at just at financial reports and CPU, and we'd be able to make a quick determination that the CPU ramped up in conjunction with all of this heavy reports activity. And right as the reports activity started dying down, so did our CPU. So based on this, and this is just one quick example, but this is something we do on a regular basis with all of our clients who are using the activity tracking performance, is we've been able to go in, quantify what's happening on the system, and start drawing correlations. And the assessment that I would make based on this data is that the activity that was happening during the time was both financial reports as well as planning forms and rules. The burst of activity that was occurring in financial report caused the CPU to saturate to some degree, and that the planning forms and business rules were directly affected by the CPU saturation. So I would say that reports is the cause. The bottleneck was the CPU, and the effect was both on financial reports as well as planning forms and rules. So I would draw a correlation of one user activity affecting the system performance, which ultimately affected the response time for other user activities. So again, a very specific example, but what we're looking at here is something that we do quite often. Okay, so that's one way to look at a down and dirty things as it's happening and be able to really drill into details. Another way that we can look at data is by reports, and I generated these yesterday. And this first report, let me just zoom in here, fit with, is going to look at user activity. And this is something that we can sort by user, we can sort by activity, or sort by date and time. In this case, it's going to give us a whole transaction log of everything that users have done. So in this case, this particular user, they did some planning activity and some reports activity during this time. And we can see in planning that they were opening up a specific form quite often. They ran a couple of business rules. In reports, we could see that they ran these various reports, and we could see for every activity approximately how long it took, and this is in milliseconds, so this is around 3.5 seconds. This business rule took 19 seconds, and then again a little bit later we could see that the same business rule took 45 seconds. And we could see the same thing with financial reports as we look down here. And we can go down to every user, including demo admin, and eventually we're going to see that user that we were analyzing before. We could see the planning activity that they were doing as well as the reports activity. So we could see exactly who was doing what down to the document that they were working on and how long it took. We can also take another view of the world called what we call document activity. It's really more a statistical report. And this is going to view the world where we see for each document, whether it's a planning rule, whether it's a planning form or financial report, over that period of time, for each document, how many times was it executed, what was the average time, and what was the max time. So we know that this planning form was opened 18 times. It took about an average around 5.5 seconds, but the max time it almost took 10 seconds. And we could do that for regardless of whether it's an HFM Smart View Grid, planning rule, planning form, or financial report. So it's another way of looking at our activity. And there's another report that we can get into that can show us the top 20 slowest forms, the top 20 slowest reports, or the top 20 most accessed reports. A number of ways to slice and dice our data. Okay. And these are available. We can run these ad hoc. We could schedule these. We could actually generate these as a result of an alert. So if we detect that our CPU is saturated, we could actually automatically generate these reports and email them to the administrator. So even if they don't have access to the Accelatis system or to the environment, they could be reviewing these various documents to see what was happening on the system leading up to the problem. Okay, so we looked at a very detailed way of looking at the world. We also looked at some formatted reports. The very last thing we're going to look at is a dashboard called SLAs. And SLAs are service level agreements. And what these are is, as we're tracking activity, we can establish performance contracts that all financial reports should take less than 20 seconds, for example, or business rules should always run within a certain amount of time. And they could be done at the activity level, like all reports, or they could be done at the document level, meaning a very specific report or a very specific rule. And we can plot these over time. And up here in this page, we're looking at a planning form, financial reports, as well as some HFM activity. And we can see that over the last 24 hours, for example, our planning form has, for the number of times it's been executed, it's met our SLA 100% of the time. The financial report, on the other hand, has only met our SLA 61% of the time. So we could see over the last slice of history how the system's been performing. We can also look at it over time. So here's a 30-day period where we can see that, boy, over this period of time, our planning form only met its SLA in the 60% range. And it got better. This was in mid-July, and around early August, it got a little bit better. It got up into the almost 70% range. Some of our other activities were almost close to 100, so this was really good. And then we see that as we got into August, it started going downhill again. So what this is showing us is an aggregate of system performance. So it's not looking at a specific instance of a planning form. It's just looking at what percentage of planning forms or reports met our SLA, and it's averaged over a 24 period of time. And lastly, we can get another view of the world where we can look at activities over time, and we can see that here in July, that planning form budget forecast was opened 204 times. In August, it was only opened 132 times. There's a financial report that was opened 110 times in July, and in August it was opened almost 600 times. So we want to balance how we're looking at the data, both over recent history, over time, and also looking at the quantities of activity. So there's a number of ways to look at the data. And just to summarize, here we looked at who is doing what, down to the document level. We could look at response over time, and this could be over a 20-minute period, or it could be over the course of a month, and we could see how certain activities slow down during certain periods. We looked at how we could plot response time with other metrics, so we're looking at how user activity might have caused CPU spike, and how the CPU saturation in return caused slowdown of other activities. So all in one place with the information just a click away. We then looked at how we could look at formatted reports, which could be generated ad hoc or automatically. And then lastly, we looked at dashboards, which again is a more aggregate view of the world. So again, this is really taking a quick slice of Accelatis user activity tracking, but we're trying to address it at many different levels. The important thing to know is that we're looking at all the key things that users are doing, and there's a number of ways to get at that information and to alert on it, and for it to provide value and help you troubleshoot your system, as well as get a profile of how the system is used. So we're about to the end of our time. I do want to say that we do have a couple upcoming webinars. Over the next couple months, we'll be talking about how Accelatis can help with migrations, as well as if you have a competency center, how Accelatis can help with that. And then in December, we're going to be getting into some HFM rules, tips, and tricks, where I'll be joined by Tony Mitri, who is one of the co-authors of the HFM rules and consolidation engine. So we'll be talking about some details there. So again, with the 21-minute format, we're about out of time. Thank you all for joining. If you do have questions and you sent them in on the webinar, we will get back to you. Otherwise, please feel free to reach out to myself or Delisi, and we'll be happy to get you both a link to this webinar as well as answer any questions you may have. Thank you again for joining.